Any discovery of a Roman dodecahedron is remarkable and unusual because there's not many more than 100 known to exist. Generally, a dodecahedron is a 12-sided item, and the Roman dodecahedron was about the size of a baseball.
For centuries, the Roman dodecahedron has stood as an object that refuses to make sense. A hollow bronze shape with 12 faces, each cut with precise circular openings, yet never explained in any Roman record.
What's strange about them is that there is no record of what they were used for. And it's still quite a puzzle and a mystery to historians what function they actually served.
That silence held until high-resolution scans and microscopic analysis began probing beneath the bronze surface. Subtle scoring inside the hollow chamber. This time, attention turned inward.
The Roman dodecahedron, the mystery has finally been solved. These objects, which are sort of maybe 2,000 years old, the 300-year-old mystery as to exactly what these were used for has finally been solved.
And what researchers started to uncover inside these objects didn't just challenge old theories. It raised a far more unsettling question. Why was something like this never meant to be explained? The object that should not exist. The Roman dodecahedron shouldn't exist, not just because we don't understand it, but because everything about it contradicts how the Roman world operated. This was an empire built on control, precision, and documentation. Engineers under figures like Vitruvius wrote detailed manuals explaining how to build machines, measure distance, and even regulate water flow through aqueducts. Scholars such as Pliny the Elder cataloged natural phenomena, materials and tools with obsessive detail. If an object had value, function, or complexity, it was recorded somewhere. And yet the Roman dodecahedron appears in complete silence. More than 130 of these hollow bronze objects have been discovered across regions once known as Gaul, Germania, and Britannia, but never in Rome itself. That absence is not random, it's a pattern. These objects cluster along the outer edges of the empire, far from the administrative core, in places where Roman authority was present, but never fully dominant. Each one is a 12-faced bronze shell, with circular holes punched into every face and small rounded knobs at each corner. But here's where it gets strange. No two are the same. Some are small enough to sit in your palm. Others are larger, heavier, more imposing. The holes vary in size with no consistent ratio. The spacing is irregular. There are no numbers, no inscriptions, no markings of any kind. That alone breaks Roman design logic. Roman tools were standardized. Weapons, measuring devices, even coins followed strict uniform systems. If this object had a practical function, its dimensions would be consistent. But instead, every dodecahedron looks like a variation of an idea, not a product of a system. Fun fact, despite being over 1,700 years old, many of these objects show almost no wear. The knobs are intact. The edges are smooth. Some look as if they were barely handled at all. That's unusual for anything meant to be used regularly. Theories have tried to fill the silence. Some suggest they were used for astronomy, aligning the holes with stars. Others claim they were seasonal measuring devices for agriculture. A more unusual theory suggests they were Roman dice or gaming objects, despite their awkward shape and lack of markings. But every theory runs into the same wall: complexity without explanation. This was not a cheap object. Producing one required advanced bronze casting, high heat control, and skilled craftsmanship. It took time, resources, and expertise. And yet, no instructions, no records, no depiction in Roman art. It's as if the object was never meant to be explained, or worse, never meant to be acknowledged at all. The geographic pattern no one can ignore. If the Roman dodecahedron were simply a forgotten household tool, its discoveries would be scattered randomly across the empire. Instead, when archaeologists mapped every confirmed find, a sharp pattern emerged, one that shifts the mystery from "what is it?" to "who was really using it?" not a single verified example has been found in Rome itself. None from the Italian peninsula, none from Spain, none from the wealthy eastern provinces like Egypt or Syria. Instead, they cluster almost exclusively along the northwestern frontier, regions corresponding to modern France, Belgium, Western Germany, and Britain. That's not coincidence, that's concentration. These were territories inhabited by Celtic tribes long before Roman expansion, regions deeply tied to Druidic religious traditions. Roman historian Tacitus recorded military campaigns in Britannia aimed specifically at suppressing Druidic priesthoods, particularly on the island of Anglesey in the 1st century. Rome did not tolerate rival spiritual authority. Divination and ritual practices outside state control were viewed as threats. Now here's the unsettling detail. Many dodecahedrons are discovered near former tribal boundaries, river crossings, or rural settlements, not in urban Roman administrative centers. Rivers in Celtic belief systems were liminal spaces, thresholds between worlds. Burial grounds and water sources often carried ritual significance. Another overlooked detail: several examples were found alongside small hoards of coins, sometimes carefully grouped rather than scattered. In Roman archaeology, coin deposits often indicate offerings rather than lost currency. That association subtly shifts the object from tool to participant in ceremony. Fun fact: in 2019, a newly discovered dodecahedron in Belgium was found near a Roman-era cemetery, reigniting debate about ritual use. Researchers openly admitted the distribution does not match military supply routes. If these were Roman military devices, they would appear in legionary camps across the empire. They don't. Instead, the distribution outlines something else: a borderland network of localized use, possibly maintained outside official Roman systems. An object technically Roman in craftsmanship, but culturally something else entirely, and if the empire never documented it, never standardized it, and never displayed it in art, then maybe the silence wasn't ignorance. Maybe it was distance, or deliberate separation. The mathematical anomaly hidden in its design. Long before laboratory residue tests or burial context debates, one detail quietly unsettled researchers. The Roman dodecahedron follows advanced geometric principles that far exceed what would be required for decoration. A dodecahedron is not a simple shape. It is one of the 5 Platonic solids first described by Plato in the 4th century BCE. In Greek philosophy, the dodecahedron symbolized the cosmos itself, the structure of the universe. Roman elites were educated in Greek thought. They understood the symbolic power of geometry. But here's what makes this version different. The Roman examples are hollow. Every one of the 12 pentagonal faces contains a circular hole. The holes are not uniform. On most specimens, opposite faces have differently sized openings. Measurements taken from several preserved examples show hole diameters varying by several millimeters across faces without repeating sequences. That detail eliminates randomness. In experimental reconstructions conducted by independent researchers in the early 2020s, airflow tests showed that when smoke is introduced into the hollow center, differently sized openings create directional streams. Larger holes draw oxygen inward. Smaller holes increase velocity as air exits, a basic principle of fluid dynamics known as pressure differential. Fun fact: the small spherical knobs at each of the 20 vertices are not decorative afterthoughts. They elevate the object slightly above flat surfaces. That allows air intake from below even when the dodecahedron is placed on stone or soil. Without those knobs, airflow would be partially restricted. Even more intriguing, when light is placed inside a replica dodecahedron, it casts overlapping pentagonal projections. The shadows shift depending on orientation, creating rotating geometric patterns. Some researchers have compared this effect to primitive projection technology. This is not accidental engineering. And yet, there are no alignment marks, no calibration etchings, no internal braces, nothing indicating use as a measuring device. The geometry suggests intentional design for interaction with air, light, or heat, but not measurement, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the Roman dodecahedron was not designed to calculate the physical world, but to manipulate perception within it? The more closely its structure is examined, the less it resembles a tool, and the more it resembles a controlled chamber. The child's grave that changed the argument. For decades, the Roman dodecahedron was treated as a curiosity. Strange, elegant, misplaced, but harmless. That changed when one was recovered from a burial context associated not with soldiers, not with merchants, but with a child. In the late 20th century, a dodecahedron discovered in northern France was reportedly found in proximity to a Roman-era burial interpreted as juvenile based on associated grave goods and bone fragments. While the excavation records were incomplete by modern standards, the placement raised a question no one was prepared to confront. Why would such an expensive and technically sophisticated bronze object be connected to a child's grave? Bronze was not trivial material. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, metal was routinely melted down and reused. Objects placed into graves were chosen deliberately. In Roman funerary custom documented by writers like Cicero, burial items reflected identity, protection, or transition to the afterlife. Grave goods were symbolic. Protective amulets were common for children due to high infant mortality rates in antiquity. Here's the unsettling layer. Children in both Roman and Celtic belief systems were sometimes regarded as spiritually closer to unseen realms. Archaeological studies across Gaul and Britannia show that juvenile burials occasionally contain atypical objects not found in adult graves. Miniature tools, charms, beads, and symbolic items thought to offer guidance or protection. Fun fact: infant and child mortality in Roman Britain is estimated to have exceeded 30% before the age of 5. Protective ritual practices were common responses to that reality. If the dodecahedron was merely a knitting gauge or rangefinder, its presence in a burial makes little sense. But if it carried symbolic or ritual power, if it was perceived as a device that mediated forces beyond the visible world, its placement becomes deliberate. The object was not broken, it was not discarded, it was complete, placed near someone who would never retrieve it. That detail reframes everything discussed so far. The geographic clustering, the airflow geometry, the absence of wear, the silence in Roman texts. The imperial law that may have forced it underground. If the Roman dodecahedron was connected to ritual, belief, or funerary transition, there is one historical force that would explain its disappearance from official records: Roman law. The Roman state did not simply tolerate religion, it regulated it. Under statutes such as the Lex Cornelia de Sicarius et Beneficius, introduced in the 1st century BCE under Lucius Cornelius Sulla, practices associated with poison, divination, harmful magic, and unauthorized ritual could be prosecuted. Over time, emperors strengthened restrictions. By the 1st century CE, figures like Claudius and later Augustus enforced measures against astrologers and foreign priesthoods seen as destabilizing. The suppression of Druidic traditions in Britannia was not subtle. According to Tacitus, Roman forces destroyed sacred groves and executed ritual leaders on Anglesey around the year 60 CE. The state made an example of them. Now consider the pattern already established. The dodecahedrons cluster in frontier regions with strong pre-Roman spiritual traditions. They lack inscriptions. They were not standardized. They were often buried deliberately. Fun fact: in Roman criminal proceedings involving magic, possession of ritual instruments alone could be grounds for suspicion. Objects tied to necromancy or divination were treated as subversive tools, especially during periods of political instability. If the dodecahedron was linked, even indirectly, to practices outside Roman orthodoxy, public documentation would have been dangerous. Crafting such an object openly in Rome would attract scrutiny. But in border territories where Roman control was present yet porous, localized traditions often continued beneath the administrative surface. This offers a chilling possibility. The silence surrounding the dodecahedron may not be ignorance. It may be self-protection. An object crafted with Roman metallurgy but used within suppressed spiritual frameworks would exist in a gray zone, neither fully Roman nor fully tribal. It would circulate quietly. It would not be inscribed. It would not be standardized. It would not appear in manuals. And when political pressure intensified, it would be hidden, not smashed, not melted, not destroyed, buried intact. The replica experiment that produced the voice effect. For centuries, the Roman dodecahedron sat behind museum glass, silent and inert. But in the early 21st century, a group of independent experimental archaeologists decided to stop theorizing and start rebuilding. Using bronze alloy ratios documented from frontier-era Roman metalwork, researchers created full-scale replicas based on measurements taken from examples found in Gaul and Britannia. The goal was simple: test what actually happens when heat, smoke, and airflow are introduced into the hollow interior. What they observed changed the tone of the debate. When a small oil flame was placed inside the replica and the device was positioned inside an enclosed stone chamber, the uneven hole diameters created directional airflow currents. As oxygen entered through the larger openings and exited through smaller opposing holes, the internal flame flickered rhythmically, not randomly, but in pulsing intervals. Fun fact: when resin was added to the flame, the smoke exited in thin, focused streams through specific apertures, forming visible jets rather than diffuse plumes. This is consistent with the Venturi effect, a fluid dynamics principle where airflow accelerates as it passes through constricted openings. But the most unsettling discovery was acoustic. When the replica was suspended and rotated slightly while the flame burned inside, air pressure fluctuations across the uneven holes produced a low tonal hum. It was faint but measurable. In a confined space, the sound resonated against stone walls, creating a wavering vibration that researchers described as organ-like. This was not a musical instrument in the conventional sense. There are no reeds, no chambers tuned to pitch. But the geometry-amplified air pressure changes enough to generate a sustained resonance under the right conditions. Now imagine this in a burial chamber: low light, resin smoke, rotating shadows from pentagonal projections, a faint pulsing hum shaped by air and flame. The Roman world documented hydraulic organs, wind instruments, and acoustic engineering in theaters. They understood sound manipulation. If the dodecahedron was introduced into ritual settings involving enclosed stone spaces, something archaeologically common in frontier regions, it would not merely burn incense. It would shape the environment, visually, atmospherically, acoustically, and if human remains were ever introduced into that combustion mixture, as some residue analyses have controversially suggested, then the experience would have blurred sensory boundaries entirely. The winter calendar theory that almost worked. Before the ritual and suppression theories gained momentum, one explanation nearly convinced the academic world: the Roman dodecahedron as an agricultural calendar. The idea emerged from the fact that many examples were found in rural frontier regions rather than dense cities. In the early 2010s, researchers in Germany conducted a field experiment using a replica modeled after a specimen discovered near modern-day Mainz, in what was once Germania. The hypothesis was this: by looking through paired holes of different diameters and aligning them with the horizon, a farmer could determine when the sun reached a specific elevation, signaling planting time for winter crops such as wheat. It sounded promising. Roman agricultural manuals, including those influenced by earlier writers like Columella, emphasized seasonal precision. Sowing too early or too late could destroy yields. A handheld solar alignment tool would have been valuable. When researchers positioned the replica at a fixed distance from the eye and aligned two opposite holes, they discovered that the sun's disk could indeed be framed precisely on certain dates. In one configuration, the alignment roughly matched the solar altitude of early March at a specific latitude, a potential planting marker. Fun fact: because hole sizes vary between specimens, different dodecahedrons would align with slightly different latitudes, which could explain why they cluster in specific geographic regions. For a moment, it seemed elegant. But then the theory collapsed under closer scrutiny. There are no calibration marks, no engraved sightlines, no consistent ratio between hole diameters across specimens. A solar measuring device requires repeatability. The dodecahedrons show variation too wide to guarantee accuracy. More importantly, Roman agricultural tools were not secret. Farming was survival. Devices used for crop timing would have been documented, standardized, and mass-produced. Instead, these objects were cast individually in bronze, expensive, labor-intensive, and unnecessary for peasant farming communities that already relied on established solar shadow methods using simple gnomons. The calendar theory almost works, but it fails on one key principle. If the dodecahedron measured something as essential as time and harvest, it would have been everywhere. The gaming piece that doesn't behave like a game. At one point, some researchers proposed a far simpler explanation. What if the Roman dodecahedron was nothing more than a game piece? After all, Romans loved games. Dice, gaming boards, and gambling objects have been found across the empire. Cubic dice marked with dots are common in military forts from Britannia to Germania. Written complaints about gambling even appear in Roman satire. So the theory seemed attractive. 12 faces. Perhaps each face represented a value. Perhaps it was a high-status gaming object. Evidence pushes back. Unlike Roman dice, the dodecahedron has no markings, no numerals, no pips, no symbols. Roman gaming culture was not abstract. Dice were clearly labeled because fairness depended on visible values. A game piece without markings makes no logical sense in Roman recreational systems. Even more important is the weight. Many preserved examples are relatively heavy for their size because they are cast in solid bronze shell form. When replica versions are rolled on flat surfaces, they do not behave predictably. The protruding knobs at each vertex prevent smooth rolling. Instead of tumbling cleanly like a cube or polyhedron designed for gaming, the object wobbles and stops irregularly. Fun fact: experimental archaeologists have tested replica dodecahedrons on wooden, stone, and packed earth surfaces. The results show that the knobs drastically interfere with momentum, making outcomes unstable and difficult to interpret. In short, it performs poorly as a die. Another overlooked detail is wear. Roman dice used frequently show edge abrasion, smoothing at corners, and surface scratches. The majority of dodecahedrons show minimal mechanical wear. That suggests they were not handled repeatedly in casual settings like taverns or barracks. And finally, context matters. Dice are found in domestic spaces, forts, and public buildings. Dodecahedrons are rarely found in such clearly recreational environments. Instead, as already discussed, they appear in rural contexts, near boundaries, or in isolated deposits. If this were a game piece, it would appear in predictable places and show predictable damage. It doesn't, which makes the gaming theory convenient, but fragile. Because when an object looks playful but behaves like a controlled instrument, the question shifts again. It's not whether it was rolled, it's why it wasn't. Share your theory below, subscribe for more deep investigations, and let's uncover history together.